Okay. All right. We are live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast YouTube channel. What's happening, everybody? I'm Ryan Thomas. Diving into all things UFC 252. We are 3 days away from UFC 252, and the backdrop shows that I am a Buffalo Bills fan, obviously. Covering the team on this channel more times than I can count. But today on the show, I'm going to be diving into UFC 252. Daniel Cormier's third fight with Stipe Miocic, the third time that both of these guys have faced off to settle the score. And this is really rare territory for, UFC, MMA to have not just a trilogy. A trilogy is not rare territory. A trilogy is not something that hasn't happened in MMA before. It's happened a bunch of times. We've seen, tons of trilogies. But a trilogy like this one, a trilogy that is the pinnacle of the sport for both of these gentlemen, a trilogy that dictates who the greatest MMA heavyweight of all time is, a trilogy that dictates who the greatest heavyweight, not just who the greatest heavyweight of all time is, but it dictates the all-time ranking for one Daniel Cormier and or Stipe. The winner of this fight is held in a lofty, lofty altitude. The loser of this fight, unfortunately, takes a back seat. But before I dive into my preview and prediction for UFC 252's main event, this is a very solid card. This is a card that features Sugar Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chico Vera in the co-main event. I'm very excited to see Sean O'Malley back in the octagon. It's a welcomed addition to the UFC as far as a fresh face, a young, hungry fighter that is climbing the ranks. I hope that the UFC builds him up the right way. I hope we see that from the UFC. I don't want to see this fighter get moved up the ladder far too soon. I want to see Sean O'Malley be moved up slowly but surely. And this next fight versus Vera is a step up in competition for Sean O'Malley, but it is also a testament to Marlon Vera and how he is viewed inside the UFC. The UFC views Marlon Vera as a fighter that won his last fight, even though he lost his last fight. The judges said he lost that last fight, but Dana White, the powers that be, believe that Vera won that fight. So Vera gets an opportunity to take on Sean O'Malley, who is a surging fighter, who is a fighter that has created a ton of buzz for himself. And you want to talk about business and marketing and all that fun stuff. Sean O'Malley has done a phenomenal job as far as putting himself in a position to be viewed as one of the up-and-coming stars inside the UFC. So this next step is a big next step for him. I'm very much looking forward to seeing. I think this is the first, truly top 10 opponent that Sean O'Malley has faced. Up until now, he hasn't faced a top 10 opponent. Whereas if Vera was given that win, which in the eyes of many he should have been, we would see, a 10 next to his name inside those UFC rankings. But instead, it is what it is. Got to work with the situation that we're given. And Sean O'Malley and Marlon Vera will be a test for Sean O'Malley, and it'll be a big test for Marlon Vera. So this is a prove-it fight for both Vera and O'Malley. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing who can come out on top between those two in the co-main event. In the heavyweight division, not just the world title fight, the heavyweight division, you have another fight separately from the UFC main event, UFC 252 main event. That would be Junior Dos Santos versus Jared Rosenstrook. And Rosenstrook just lost his first professional bout, lost his last fight to Francis Ngannou, and that was a drubbing. It was quick. There's not really much to say about it other than he got knocked out. There was no other context for me to provide you guys as far as what actually took place in that fight, because not a whole lot happened. The only thing that happened was Francis Ngannou threw a couple wild punches, and Rosenstrook, that was it. That was that. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing how Jared Rosenstrook comes back from this devastating loss in a fight that he asked for. He asked for Francis Ngannou. He got Francis Ngannou and he got destroyed. So a little bit of humble pie for Jared Rosenstrook. And now he gets his bounce back fight is against a former UFC heavyweight champion in Junior Dos Santos, who has probably the best pure boxing in terms of boxing acumen, probably the best pure boxing in the UFC heavyweight division. That's how he won the title. That's how he defended the title. So I think, that fight will be very interesting as well. We see a lot of new blood in this UFC heavyweight division, not just Francis Ngannou, but Curtis Blades is out there. Jaron Rozenstruik is out there. I'm very much looking forward to seeing whether Rozenstruik can bounce back, or if Junior Dos Santos can get this win off of Jared Rozenstruik, that puts him right back in there as a title contender. Alistair Overeem is still kicking around. Derek Lewis is coming off a big win over Alexei Olnik last week. So the UFC heavyweight division is solving some riddles. We're getting some puzzle pieces to fit once these fights actually happen. So a lot of unanswered questions that we've been asking ourselves as MMA fans for quite some time will be answered off of this event, UFC 252. Another fight that I'm really looking forward to is at bantamweight. It would be John Donson versus Marab Devlish Villi. Devlish Villi is a young fighter in terms of UFC wise. He's kind of green, whereas John Dodson has been in the UFC for quite some time now. Former Ultimate Fighter contestant. He had a lot of solid fights in his career, but one that really stands out to me was a bout versus the then champ Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. He gave Mighty Mouse a little bit of a run for his money there. So, and that was at the time where Mighty Mouse was just running through everyone. So, can Dodson turn back the clock a little bit here? Can we get him to reclaim a little bit of that magic that he once had? We'll find out. But main card wise, I mean, there's some really solid fights on this card that I'm greatly looking forward to. Preliminary card, you do have the veteran Jim Miller versus Vince Pichell. Pichell, he's 12-2. He's looked pretty good in his last few fights. And Jim Miller is as game an opponent as anyone in the UFC. 32-14 and 1 with no contest. The one fight being a no contest. Jim Miller's fought everyone and anyone. He's fought them all. The preliminary card is on ESPN, whereas the main card, the pay-per-view portion, will be, of course, on ESPN+. So I'll throw that out there for the fight fans as well. Felice Herrig versus Verna Jandrodroba. Felice Herrig is 14-8. Jandrodroba 15-1. Very much looking forward to seeing how that shapes up between Felice Herrig and Verna Jandrodroba. Herrig, a vet. Jandrodroba, a young fighter in the UFC. So you see a lot of that on this card. You see a lot of veteran fighters on this card going up against some younger fighters testing their mettle. The early prelim, there's not really a whole lot there. So, but let's get to it. I gave you a little bit of a preview, a rundown, if you will, of the card itself, but the first 8 minutes and 30 seconds of the show. And for those of you that want to hear more from me, you can follow me on Twitter at Ryan Thomas Take. You can also follow me on Instagram at Ryan Thomas Take. And you can also subscribe to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, obviously, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Friday's show, there will be plenty of guests. 2 guests in particular, actually, for Friday. And then the following Wednesday, we'll have some guests as well. We meaning me, I'll be playing host to a couple guests on the show. We've had a few guests the last few days, the last few weeks, and I am very much looking forward to having a few of these people on. So this is what I really love to do, is interviewing people and getting back into interviewing people. That was one of my strong suits when I was in school, and getting back into that has been fantastic for me. So very much looking forward to it. As I've said this whole show, I'm looking forward to a lot. If you can't tell, looking forward to a lot. So let's get right into it. I want to dive into 3 fights in particular. Let's dive into Junior Dos Santos versus Jarzinio Rozenstruik. I love Junior Dos Santos. I want to let that be known before I give you my pick for that fight. Junior Dos Santos has been one of my favorite fighters in the UFC really since day one. He burst onto the scene with a true upset victory over Fabricio Verdum, and those in the mixed martial arts world know that Fabricio Verdum could be considered, as of right now, as the greatest MMA heavyweight ever. He beat Fedor when Fedor couldn't be beaten. He beat Cain Velasquez in Mexico City to win the title. He unfortunately lost that title to Stipe Miocic, the current champ, prior to their trilogy with DC and all the stuff that has led us to where we are now. But Junior Dos Santos was an unknown name, an unknown commodity in mixed martial arts at that time. He threw a beautiful picture-perfect uppercut that dropped Fabricio Verdum, and off to the races. Junior Dos Santos hasn't looked back since. Yeah, he's won some. Yeah, he's lost some. But, he's still a name in this division. His last fight, he lost via knockout to Curtis Blades. And that was not the performance that any of us expected from Junior Dos Santos. So in terms of what Junior Dos Santos am I expecting, and that's a question that we can all ask ourselves, I'm expecting a very motivated, very hungry Junior Dos Santos, who's lost 2 straight via knockout, one to Ngannou and one to Curtis Blades. So, I'm expecting a very motivated Rosenstrook as well, who both of these guys have been knocked out by Francis Ngannou, who stakes his claim pretty soon, fortunately for him, pretty soon, as the next great UFC heavyweight champion. Depending on what happens with this DC fight, DC wins this fight, he's going to ride off into the sunset, I believe. But we'll dive into that. If Stipe wins, then you have a real solid storyline for Miocic versus Ngannou 2, because both of those guys have fought before, and Miocic got through the phenomenon that was Francis Ngannou then. Now, Francis Ngannou is in this second act of his career. And the fallout of that is Junior Dos Santos getting knocked out by Ngannou, as well as Rozenstruik getting knocked out by Ngannou. So now we got to find out which guy is still relevant in this division, which guy can maintain his relevancy in this division. And Junior Dos Santos, Jared Rozenstruik, I am going with Rozenstruik for this one. I love Junior Dos Santos, but I feel like Rozenstruik has a lot more miles left on the tires. Junior Dos Santos enters this fight as a 36-year-old heavyweight. It oftentimes is not about the miles on the car, but it's about the miles that the car has left. But in the case of Junior Dos Santos, he suffered 2 very vicious knockout losses to both Francis Ngannou and Curtis Blades, as I've mentioned. And I just don't know what Junior Dos Santos actually has left for Jared Rozenstruik. Each fight chips a little bit away at the skill set. You lose a little bit. You leave the octagon a lesser version of the person that you walked in as. And I think that could be the case here with Junior Dos Santos. So I'm going with Jared Rozenstruik for that fight at UFC 252. And those are the 3 fights in particular that I really want to dive into. The featured bout between Dos Santos and Rozenstruik, the bantamweight co-main event between Sean O'Malley and Marlon Vera. Listen, Marlon Vera, as I said, is probably the best opponent that Sean O'Malley has ever faced. And that says a lot because Eddie Wineland was the last opponent that Sean O'Malley faced, former WEC champ back in the day. But again, that was back in the day. Sean O'Malley is facing off against an older fighter, and Eddie Wineland. He knocks out Eddie Wineland in pretty devastating fashion. And oftentimes with UFC stars, guys that are on the come up, we ask ourselves, how legit is this guy? How legit is he? Is the phenomenon for real? Is he for real? And with Sean O'Malley, I can say he is for real. This guy has extremely slick striking skills. This guy has the fight IQ of a veteran, and he's 12-0. 12-0. I mean, 12-0 undefeated, yes, but only has fought 12 professional fights. You watch him fight, you think to yourself, this guy's been around for years. This guy has knocked out plenty of foes. No, he is not. He's knocked out plenty of foes in 12 professional fights, but he is a young, up-and-coming fighter. You wouldn't think that when watching Sean O'Malley fight. You see a guy that is very skilled, very game, and very ready to take over. And I'm very excited for Sean O'Malley and his future beyond this fight, because I think Sean O'Malley is going to win this fight. And beyond this fight, wondering what's next. That's always the question with some of these fighters, but wondering what's next with Sean O'Malley, I think, is one of the biggest questions in the sport right now, because we haven't seen a young fighter like this really take over, really take the division on full steam ahead in quite some time. We haven't seen that. Maybe since Connor, Cody Garbrandt was another one at bantamweight, oddly enough. There's been some talk about them fighting, but now with Cody Garbrandt moving down to fight Davison Figueiredo for the 125-pound flyweight title, I think Sean O'Malley, inches himself closer to the top 5 with a win over Marlon Vera that puts him in the top 10. So the next opponent would be a top 7, top 8 opponent for Sean O'Malley to just inch him closer and closer. And I don't want to see him get rushed. I spoke about that pretty briefly at the beginning of the show. I don't want to see Sean O'Malley get rushed. I want to see the UFC build him in very adequate fashion, in a smart business sense. I want to see Sean O'Malley get built the proper way. I don't want to see him get rushed, because I truly think that this guy could be around for a real long time as a champion if he's built up the right way. Similar to what John Jones, the beginning career of John Jones, they built him up phenomenally. He fought Vladimir Matyushenko, who was a game veteran. He fought a few guys that had, a lot of knockouts on the record. He fought Ryan Bader leading up to his title shot versus Shogun Rua, which was unexpected. They gave that to him due to the fact that Rashad, hurt his knee and had to pull out. But that's what I want to see from the UFC and Sean O'Malley. It's not about Sean O'Malley. It's more about how he's going to be built. And I think, if I'm looking at those two fights there, just to brief recap it, Junior Dos Santos versus Jared Rozenstruik, I'm going with Rosenstroke. And then in the co-main, I'm going with Sean O'Malley. I think he is going to win via knockout. And now on to the main event, the main fight that it's the biggest fight in UFC heavyweight history. It's the biggest fight in MMA heavyweight history, not just UFC. Oftentimes it gets said, UFC heavyweight history. No, mixed martial arts history. This is the biggest one. Stipe Miocic, Daniel Cormier, the third time around. The first fight, Daniel Cormier won via knockout in the first round. The second fight, Stipe Miocic down 3-0 on all 3 judges' scorecards in that second fight. Heading into the fourth round, Stipe Miocic made a massive adjustment that allowed him to win the fight in devastating fashion, landing 14 of 16 body strikes, putting Daniel Cormier on the back foot, throwing a 1-2 jab straight combination that sent DC reeling against the cage, crumbling to the canvas en route to a TKO, fourth round TKO victory for the new and again 2-time UFC heavyweight champion Stipe Miocic. It was a thrilling fight. And I provide you that narrative to this third fight due to the fact that this third fight has all the juice, has all the flair between both Stipe and DC. This is a true rivalry. This is one of the best trilogies that we could ever be offered, and in a sport that has had so many great trilogies. I look at Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell, Junior Dos Santos, Cain Velasquez. I look at Dominic Cruz and Uriah Faber. I look at Gray Maynard and Frankie Edgar. There has been so many great fights in the UFC organization, trilogy-wise, that I think this one might end up on paper being the best. It's all dependent on what actually happens in this third fight. We need, as I like to say, we need a definitive result to this third fight in order to refer to this as the greatest trilogy in MMA history, or the greatest heavyweight trilogy. But in terms of what is at stake, this is the biggest legacy fight in quite a long time. I can't remember a fight in UFC history that legacy-wise, there is so much at stake. The winner of this fight is held in regard as the greatest heavyweight ever in MMA history. And the loser of this fight is second fiddle to the best, is second best. And I mentioned Fabricio Verdum, but Miocic knocked out Verdum. Miocic knocked out Overeem. Miocic beat Francis Ngannou when nobody thought he was beating Francis Ngannou. I certainly didn't. And Daniel Cormier has had quite the illustrious career. Say what you want about Daniel Cormier. I feel like there is this unjustifiably negative perception of Daniel Cormier. I know sometimes it can be a little bit corny and a little bit too much, but at the same time, you look at his career, given the circumstances, he's accomplished everything that you could possibly accomplish. He could have walked away from the sport as one of the best, but the competitor in Daniel Cormier, the facet of Daniel Cormier that makes him so special in comparison to most, is that he is such a ultra competitor that he couldn't walk away without a definitive result to this trilogy. And here we are. I think a few factors play into this fight, a few factors that aren't really being talked about a whole lot. I watched the UFC Countdown show, and I try not to read into these things too much, but in a fight as big as this one, there's no such thing as reading into things too much. The emotions that are on display for a fight of this magnitude are unlike any other between Stipe and DC. Both of these guys know what is at stake, and they're wearing it on their sleeve. Stipe, to me, seems very agitated, seems very bitter, dare I say, in regards to how that first fight ended still, and in regards to how the second fight really started off. As I said, within those first 3 rounds on all 3 judges' scorecards, Stipe was losing. Stipe was not winning the fight. He was losing. So, Stipe had to make a massive adjustment. He made that massive adjustment, but the narrative prior to him making that massive adjustment is that he was losing, and he probably doesn't like that. More so not that people are saying that, the average person, more so that he knows that. He knows that those first 3 rounds, he was getting hit far too often and wasn't moving his feet. He was staying in the pocket, his corner, imploring him, move your damn feet. And Stipe was like a cement statue in moments in that fight. I've watched both fights multiple times extremely closely. And Daniel Cormier is not known for landing punches at will. You look at his fights with John Jones. John Jones was really able to move his feet and avoid a lot of those herky-jerky strikes from the short but stocky and powerful Daniel Cormier at heavyweight. You can't underestimate Daniel Cormier in terms of the power that he brings at heavyweight. There is a difference between his power at heavyweight with the more weight, 240, 250, 260 in that first fight. He was thick in that first fight. Daniel Cormier has a power difference at heavyweight compared to his career at light heavyweight. It was apparent to me right away. Watching that first fight with Stipe and the second one. So Stipe's got to get out of the way of those shots, move and circle. That is going to be tough for Stipe. It already is tough for Stipe. It's going to be even tougher for Stipe, given that in this particular fight, it'll be held at the UFC Apex due to the fact that we have COVID-19. And, the UFC Apex cage is 25 feet around, where the normal, regular UFC cage is 35 feet. So you're talking about a 10 feet difference in dimensions, which will make the octagon much smaller, which would help a fighter that likes to close the distance, initiate the clinch, and work to get the takedown. DC. So I think Daniel Cormier has a massive advantage going into this fight due to the fact that this octagon is smaller. And Stipe, his biggest disadvantage is that he couldn't circle, couldn't move his feet in a 35-foot cage. Now the cage is smaller, so he's really going to have to get on that bike, and he's really going to have to move out of the way from Daniel Cormier's shot and his punches. Because I think the wrestling department from Daniel Cormier was not used nearly enough in the second fight. Definitely wasn't used nearly enough in the first fight because it only lasted a round. And I think we're going to see Daniel Cormier somewhat go back to the beginning of his career, back in the Strikeforce days. He was really working the takedowns to initiate the punches rather than initiating the punches to get the takedown. I think Daniel Cormier has to get back to that, and I think Daniel Cormier knows that he has to get back to that. And I see Daniel Cormier winning this fight via decision. If it isn't a decision, I could see Daniel Cormier winning the fight via TKO, via ground and pound, or maybe even via submission. Daniel Cormier has 2 really big submission wins on his resume, both over Anthony Rumble Johnson, both in title fights, both due to the fact that he was working from top position, was able to work those submissions and make that happen. That's how I see the fight going down. I think DC is going to get this done. I think he's going to ride off into the sunset as the heavyweight champ. And just to play the speculation game here, wondering what is next for Daniel Cormier. If he does get this win, will he ride off into the sunset? I hope he does. I think Daniel Cormier deserves that hallmark bookend to a career that was mired in controversy and all that crap. And it wasn't even his fault. It was more John Jones that put that on him. It wasn't DC's fault that John Jones was doing the stuff he was doing outside of the octagon. DC could only control himself and put himself in a very positive position to win that light heavyweight title. But the caveat to that is, well, he didn't beat John Jones. So can we refer to him as the UFC light heavyweight champ? Yeah, we can. John Jones didn't represent himself the right way, didn't represent the UFC. He got stripped of the title. Daniel Cormier won the title. That's how I look at it. But, the fact that he never fought, the fact that he never beat John Jones, the second fight at UFC 214 was overturned and ruled a no contest due to the fact that Jones tested positive. You can't control that if you're DC. So for DC to be able to have control of his own narrative, excuse me, for DC to be able to have control of his own narrative in this fight and walk out his way, I think there's few better endings to any career in the sport outside of Georges St-Pierre. It's very rare that you can walk away from the sport like GSP did, and Daniel Cormier has a massive opportunity here to go out a true hero, a true MMA icon. And I think he will. I think Daniel Cormier gets it done at UFC 252 this Saturday night on ESPN Plus pay-per-view. I'm Ryan Thomas. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, my UFC 252 preview and prediction. Predicting all the fights on UFC 252's main card, and hope you enjoyed the show. For more, you can follow me on Twitter again at Ryan Thomas Take, as well as Instagram at Ryan Thomas Take. And you can also subscribe, hit the subscribe button right here, right below, and tune in for more of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts as well. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.